If someone had told me a year ago that my life, my meticulously curated, quiet, solitary life, would be irrevocably altered by the man in apartment 4B, I would have laughed. Not a real laugh, but the dry, rustling sound I made when confronted with absurdity. Because the man in 4B was a different species. A creature of noise and motion and a brand of casual confidence that felt like a foreign language. He was a paramedic. A hero in steel-toed boots who wrestled with death for a living, while I wrestled with the footnotes of forgotten histories in the silent dust of my study. We were not meant to intersect. Our orbits were fixed, parallel lines destined to run alongside each other in the narrow hallway of our building, never touching. I was wrong. I had never been more wrong about anything in my life. My world was built on routine. It was a fortress against the chaos I spent my days chronicling. The sun would slice through the gap in my curtains at 6:37. The kettle would whistle at 6:45. By 7, I would be at my desk, a cup of Earl Grey steaming beside me, the glow of my monitor pushing back the last of the shadows. My apartment was my sanctuary, a library of the heart, with books stacked in every corner, their spines a silent chorus of stories more interesting than my own. From my window, I had a perfect oblique view of the building's entrance. It was from his perch that I first saw him. Marcus. He moved with an economy of motion that was almost brutal. Everything about him was decisive, from the way he slammed his truck door to the purposeful stride that ate up the pavement. He was tall, broad in a way that seemed to strain the fabric of his dark blue uniform. His hair was short, dark, and practical. His jaw was always set, as if he were perpetually bracing for an impact. He was, to my quiet and observant eye, terrifyingly alive. I cataloged his existence in fragments. The weary slump of his shoulders after a long shift. The rare, startling sound of his laughter echoing up from the parking lot as he spoke to a friend. The way he'd run a hand over his head, a gesture of pure exhaustion that seemed to be the only crack in his armor. He was the protagonist of a story I was not a part of. A story of sirens and flashing lights, of grit and adrenaline. My story was written in ink and silence. He was a creature of the tangible world. I was a ghost in the archives. This was the distance between us. Not just the 12 feet of hallway carpet, but a chasm of experience and being. He was the sun, and I was a planetoid in the Kuiper Belt, content to observe his light from a safe and frozen distance. I told myself it was simple fascination, an academic interest in a contrasting specimen of humanity. It was a lie, of course, a beautiful, carefully constructed lie that allowed me to function. It allowed me to nod stiffly when we passed, to feel the frantic bird of my heart beat against my ribs, and to pretend it was just a neighborly, physiological response. Nothing more. He was straight. The evidence was anecdotal but compelling. The pretty blonde who sometimes picked him up on a Friday night, the casual way he talked about women with the building superintendent. He was a closed book, written in a language I could never hope to read. So I kept my distance. I maintained the status quo. My life was my routine, and he was merely a recurring, slightly painful detail in the scenery. A splash of vibrant, impossible color in my monochrome world. I was safe in my fortress of silence. I was fine, until the day the chaos refused to stay outside my window. It began with a sound that ripped through the placid afternoon quiet of my research. Not a siren, not at first. It was a terrible metallic scream of protest, followed by a concussive boom that rattled the century-old glass in my window frames. My teacup vibrated against its saucer, a frantic porcelain tremor. My heart leaped into my throat. I was at the window in 2 strides, my carefully ordered world already tilting on its axis. Below, on the street that was usually a sleepy residential thoroughfare, there was a nightmare unfolding in twisted metal and shattered glass. A delivery truck and 2 cars had collided. It was violent, final, awful. People were shouting. A car horn was stuck, blaring a single monotonous note of panic into the air. And then the siren started. Close. So terrifyingly close. I should have looked away. I should have retreated into the safety of my apartment, back to my books and my quiet. It was not my world. It was his. But I couldn't move. I was frozen, a spectator to the kind of raw, brutal reality I only ever read about. The first ambulance screamed around the corner. Then another. I saw uniforms, flashing lights, painting chaotic strokes of red and blue across the brick facades of the buildings. They moved with that same brutal efficiency I'd seen in him. A controlled storm descending on a scene of utter chaos. And then I saw him. Marcus. He wasn't in his usual rig. He must have been nearby, maybe even in the building, because he was running toward the wreck, pulling on a reflective jacket over a plain t-shirt. He wasn't on duty, but he was running toward the fire, not away. Of course he was. I watched, my breath a stone in my chest, as he became part of the storm. He was pointing, directing, his voice lost to the cacophony, but his authority absolute. He knelt by the driver's side of the most damaged car, disappearing into the wreckage for a moment before re-emerging, his expression unreadable from my vantage point. It felt like hours passed. The world outside my window was a tableau of methodical urgency. Firefighters used a tool that whined like a tortured animal to cut a door from its hinges. Other paramedics moved with stretchers and bags I didn't want to understand. I saw Marcus help lift someone onto a gurney. I saw him talking to a police officer, his hands moving in sharp, descriptive gestures. I saw the moment the energy shifted, the moment the frantic rescue operation began to transition into the slower, more somber process of clearing the scene. He stayed long after the ambulances had screamed away into the distance. He stood with his hands on his hips, his broad back to my building, just staring at the space where the worst of it had been. A tow truck was already hooking up the mangled remains of a sedan. He finally turned, and even from 4 floors up, I could see it. The armor was gone. The confident stride was replaced by a slow, heavy trudge. He looked hollowed out, a man drained of everything. He disappeared into the entrance of our building. My heart was still hammering a frantic, painful rhythm against my ribs. I backed away from the window, my own hands shaking. I tried to return to my desk, to the comforting certainty of my research. The words on the page were meaningless squiggles. The silence of my apartment was no longer peaceful. It was empty. It felt wrong. I made tea. It was what I did. The ritual was supposed to be calming, but my hands fumbled with the canister, spilling fragrant leaves across the counter. The kettle's whistle sounded less like a comfort and more like a shriek. I didn't know what I needed, but I couldn't stay in my room. I opened my apartment door, telling myself I was just going to check the mail. A lie. A flimsy, transparent lie. The hallway was quiet, smelling faintly of antiseptic and the damp, metallic scent of the recent rain. And there he was. He was sitting on the top step of the stairs leading down to the 3rd floor, his back against the wall. His head was in his hands, his elbows resting on his knees. He hadn't even made it to his own apartment door. He was just stopped, broken down in the middle of the journey home. My feet froze on the welcome mat. He hadn't heard me. He was utterly lost in his own world, a world I had just witnessed a sliver of from my window. I should have closed the door. I should have retreated and left him to his privacy. It was the polite thing to do, the safe thing to do. But my feet wouldn't move. My hand was still on the doorknob. He lifted his head, then, as if he could feel my gaze. His eyes found mine. They were wrecked. That was the only word for them. A landscape of exhaustion and something deeper, something far more unsettling. He looked straight through me for a second, and then a flicker of recognition. The quiet guy from 4D, the book nerd. He didn't say anything. He just looked at me, and then I saw it. His hands, his strong, capable hands, the ones I'd seen direct a crisis, the ones I'd seen gesture with such certainty. They were trembling. Not a slight tremor, but a violent, uncontrollable shaking. He clenched them into fists, but the muscles in his forearms just quivered, betraying the effort. The sight of it broke something in me. The carefully constructed wall between my world and his just dissolved. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't a different species. He was just a man, sitting on a staircase, trying to hold himself together. The words left my mouth before I could stop them. My voice was rough from disuse. "Are you all right?" A stupid question. A ridiculously stupid question. Of course he wasn't all right. He let out a short, harsh breath that might have been a laugh in another life. He looked down at his shaking hands again, as if they belonged to someone else. Yeah, Peachy, his voice was gravelly. Raw. I took a step forward. My heart was a drum against my sternum. Go back inside, Leo. This is not your business. But I couldn't. I saw from my window, I said, my voice barely a whisper. The accident. He nodded slowly, not looking at me. Wasn't an accident. It was a choice. Guy ran a red light. Going 80-inch, he stopped, swallowing hard. There was a kid in the other car. The words hung in the sterile hallway air between us. Heavy. Awful. I had no words for that. My entire vocabulary, my world of language and historical precedent, was useless here. All I had was a single, stupid, impulsive thought. I just made tea, I said. It sounded insane. Pathetic. He finally looked up at me again. His eyes were unfocused for a second, and then they cleared. He saw me. Not the neighbor, not the book nerd. Just another person. He looked at my open door, at the warm slice of light spilling into the hallway. It looked like a refuge. He tried to push himself up, bracing a hand against the wall. It shook so badly he had to stop. The frustration on his face was agonizing to watch. And then he asked the question that changed everything. His voice was low, stripped of all its usual confidence. It was the sound of a man at the absolute end of his rope. Can I? He broke off, taking a ragged breath. Can I just come in for a minute? Just until my hand stopped shaking, my heart stopped. And then it started again, a painful, hopeful lurch. I just nodded, unable to speak, and stepped back, holding the door open wider. It was an invitation. It was a surrender. The fortress was breached. He walked past me into my apartment. The small space, usually my entire universe, suddenly seemed to shrink around him. He brought the smell of the street with him. Ozone, rain, and something acrid and metallic I didn't want to identify. He stood in the middle of my living room, looking lost among my towers of books, his sheer physical presence a disruption of the quiet order. He looked like a mountain that had been dropped into the middle of a Zen garden. I closed the door, and the sound of the latch clicking into place felt impossibly loud. Final. He was still looking at his hands. The shaking hadn't subsided. It was a physical manifestation of the horror he carried inside him. Tea, I said again, the word a flimsy anchor in the sudden, overwhelming reality of him in my home. Sit down. I'll get you some tea. He sank onto my sofa without a word, his body moving with a leaden exhaustion. He didn't lean back. He just perched on the edge, his forearms on his knees, his head hung low, those terrifyingly fragile hands dangling between them. In the kitchen, I moved on autopilot. Kettle, mug, tea at bake. My own hands were trembling now, a sympathetic tremor. I was acutely aware of him, just a room away. I could hear the unsteady rhythm of his breathing. The silence in my apartment was different now. It wasn't empty anymore. It was full of him, full of his pain. I carried the mug back to him. It was a large, sturdy ceramic mug, one of my favorites. It looked small and delicate in the context of his presence. Here, I said softly. He looked up. His eyes were bloodshot, the skin around them bruised with fatigue. For the first time, I was close enough to see the details I'd only ever guessed at from my window. A faint, white scar that cut through his left eyebrow. The dark stubble shadowing his jaw. The deep lines etched around his mouth. He looked older than I'd thought. Worn. He reached for the mug, and this was it. The moment. The first touch. His fingers, large and calloused, brushed against mine as he took the mug. A jolt, sharp and electric, shot up my arm. It was like grabbing a live wire. My skin burned where he'd made contact. My breath hitched. It was nothing. It was everything. An accidental collision of worlds. He didn't seem to notice. Or, if he did, he gave no sign. His focus was entirely on getting the hot mug to his lips without spilling it. He had to use both hands to steady it, the ceramic rattling against his teeth as he took a sip. I retreated to the armchair opposite the sofa, my own body thrumming with a strange, panicked energy. I was in a position of care. Me, the observer, the one who hid from the world. I was now the one providing comfort to the man who wrestled with it for a living. The dynamic was so completely inverted it made me dizzy. We sat in silence for a long time. The only sounds were the ticking of the clock on my wall and the ragged sound of his breathing, which slowly, almost imperceptibly, began to even out. He drank the tea in slow, deliberate sips. I watched the tension in his shoulders ease, muscle by muscle. The violent shaking in his hands subsided into a faint, intermittent tremor. He was a rescuer, but no one was there to rescue him. Except, apparently, me. And all I had to offer was a quiet room and a hot cup of tea. It felt profoundly inadequate. Finally, he spoke, his voice still rough. He was staring into the dregs of his tea, as if the future were written there. "I hate it," he said. The words were quiet, but they landed in the room with the force of a shout. "The shaking?" I asked, my voice cautious. "That," he said, nodding. "And this?" He gestured vaguely at his own chest. "The replay. It runs on a loop. The sound. The smell." He shuddered, a full-body tremor this time. "I can't turn it off." He looked up at me then, his eyes searching my face for something. Understanding? Judgment? I didn't know. All I knew was that the mask of the strong, silent hero was gone. This was what was underneath. A man just as fragile as any of the people he saved. Maybe more so, because he had to see it all. "Everyone thinks we're made of stone," he continued, his voice low and bitter. "They see the uniform, and they think we're immune. We're not. We just get good at hiding the cracks." His own words seemed to break something loose in him. "I have to go home, and my neighbor, Mrs. Gable, she'll ask me if I had a good day. And I have to smile and say yes. Because what am I supposed to say? No, Carol. I spent my afternoon trying to keep a 7-year-old girl's brain inside her head while firefighters cut her out of a car that smelled like gasoline and blood. What do you say to that?" The confession hung in the air, raw and bleeding. He wasn't talking to me, not really. He was just talking into the quiet space I had provided. I was a witness, a confessor. My own solitude, which had always felt like a shield, suddenly seemed like a different kind of prison. He dealt with the messy, unbearable truth of life and death, and I hid from it. But his pain, right here, right now, was more real than anything in my books. "You don't have to say anything," I found myself saying. The words were soft, but sure. "Here, you don't. You could just be." He looked at me, really looked at me, and for the first time, I felt seen. Not as the weird, quiet neighbor, but as a person. His gaze was intense, stripped of all pretense. It was terrifying. It was wonderful. The light outside was beginning to fade, painting the room in soft shades of gray and lavender. The streetlights flickered on, casting long shadows through the window. We were in a pocket of time, a bubble of quiet suspension in the heart of the city. The air in the room grew thick, charged with everything unsaid between us. Not just tonight, but for the past year of silent observation. He set the empty mug down on the coaster I'd placed on the coffee table. His hands were still. "They stopped," he said, his voice a murmur. He held them out, palms up. They were steady. "Good," I whispered. "He should have left then. That was the deal. He could stay until his hands stopped shaking." They had stopped. He should have said thank you, stood up, and walked out of my apartment and back into his own life. He didn't move. Neither did I. The space between the sofa and my armchair felt like a mile-wide canyon, and a string pulled taut. "Why are you being so nice to me?" he asked. The question was genuine. He sounded truly baffled, as if kindness were a foreign concept. My heart hammered against my ribs. "Tell him. Just tell him something true. Because you look like you needed someone to be," I said. My voice didn't shake. I was surprised. He stared at me, his dark eyes searching my face. The silence stretched, thin and humming. He was seeing the years of my own loneliness. I was sure of it. He was seeing the quiet longing I had so carefully hidden. And then he stood up, but he didn't move toward the door. He took 2 steps and stood in front of my chair, looming over me. My breath caught. My entire body went rigid. This is it. He's realized who I am, what I am. He's disgusted. He's going to say something awful and then leave. He didn't. He lowered himself, crouching down so his eyes were level with mine. The proximity was overwhelming. I could smell the faint, clean scent of soap beneath the grim smells of his day. I could see the individual lashes framing his exhausted eyes. "No one ever asks if I'm okay," he said, his voice so quiet it was almost a thought. "They just assume I am." My throat was too tight to speak. I could only nod. "You did," he said. "You looked at me, and you saw." He reached out, slowly, as if not to startle me. His hand, the one that had been shaking so violently just an hour before, came to rest on my knee. His touch was warm, solid, and it sent a tremor through my entire body. It wasn't the sharp, electric jolt from before. This was a deep, resonant hum. A question. I didn't pull away. I couldn't. I just stared into his eyes, my whole world narrowing to the few inches of space between our faces. He took my stillness as permission. He leaned in, his gaze dropping to my mouth for a fraction of a second before returning to my eyes. The movement was so slow, so hesitant, it was agonizing. It gave me 1,000 opportunities to stop him, to turn my head, to push him away. I did none of them. His lips met mine. It wasn't a passionate kiss. It wasn't hungry or desperate. It was questioning. It was soft, unbelievably gentle. It was the taste of Earl Grey and salt and exhaustion. It was a confession of a different kind. It was a man who had spent his day holding the world together, finally allowing himself to fall apart just a little. And he had chosen to fall here, with me. My eyes fluttered shut. I lifted a hand, my own now, and rested it on his shoulder. I could feel the hard muscle beneath his t-shirt. Solid. Real. He was real, and he was here, and he was kissing me. The kiss ended as gently as it began. He pulled back just enough to look at me, his forehead resting against mine. His breath was warm on my skin. "Leo," he whispered. He knew my name. I didn't know he knew my name. "Marcus," I breathed back. It was all we said. We stayed like that for a long time, in the dim light of my quiet, book-filled living room. The world outside, with its sirens and its chaos, faded away to nothing. There was only the solid weight of his hand on my knee, the warmth of his breath, and the impossible, terrifying, wonderful reality of what had just happened. The turning point. The moment after which nothing could ever be the same again. He didn't go home. I offered him the couch, a gesture that felt both painfully polite and ridiculously inadequate after what had just passed between us. He just shook his head, a small, tired movement. "Can I just—" he started, then trailed off, looking toward my bedroom door. The question hung in the air, fragile and heavy. It wasn't a proposition. It was a plea for proximity, for a safe harbor through the night. I nodded. "Okay." We didn't talk as we moved through the motions of preparing for sleep. I gave him a new toothbrush from the package I kept for, well, I didn't know who I kept it for a future that had never seemed possible. He washed his face in my sink, and the sound of the running water was the most normal, domestic thing I had ever heard in my apartment. He slept in his t-shirt and boxers. I slept in mine. The bed, which had always felt vast and empty, was now crowded with his presence. We lay on our backs, a careful foot of space between us, staring up at the ceiling. The silence was no longer comfortable or charged. It was tense, awkward, fraught with the enormity of the line we had crossed. His breathing deepened first, a slow, steady rhythm that told me he had finally succumbed to his bone-deep exhaustion. I lay awake for hours listening to him breathe. I was acutely aware of the warmth radiating from his body, of the sheer fact of him beside me in the dark. My heart felt like a frantic, trapped bird in my chest. What have I done? What have we done? Eventually, I drifted into a shallow, restless sleep, my dreams filled with the phantom sensations of his lips on mine. When I woke, the sun was already casting its familiar slice of light across the room. And I was alone. The space beside me in the bed was empty. Not just empty, but cold. He had been gone for a while. Panic, cold and sharp, seized me. He set both doplights. My eyes scanned the room. His uniform, which he'd draped over a chair, was gone. His boots were gone from by the door. There was nothing. No note. No sign he had ever been there at all, except for the faint, lingering scent of his soap and the indentation his head had left on the pillow next to mine. My stomach filled with a swarm of angry bees. He left. He ran. The thoughts came, fast and cruel. It was a mistake. A moment of weakness. He was traumatized, and you were just there, a port in a storm. And now it's morning, and the storm has passed, and he's realized what he did. He kissed a man. He kissed you, and he's disgusted. He's ashamed. I stumbled out of bed and into the living room. The empty teacup was still on the coffee table, the only piece of evidence. I picked it up. My own hand started to shake. This was my punishment for breaking the routine, for opening the door, for letting the chaos in. I had dared to hope, for a few short hours, that my orbit could change, and the universe had snapped me back into my cold, distant place with brutal efficiency. My solitude, once a comfort, was now a physical weight. The silence of my apartment didn't feel peaceful. It felt like an accusation. It screamed his absence. Every book on my shelves seemed to mock me, their stories of love and connection a testament to a world I was once again locked out of. I spent the day in a fog of self-recrimination. I tried to work, but the historical texts were just black marks on a white page. Every creak in the hallway, every footstep on the stairs sent a jolt of pathetic, desperate hope through me. My ears were tuned to the sound of his truck, my eyes constantly straying to the window. Nothing. The day bled into a long, agonizing night. I didn't sleep. I just lay in bed, staring at the empty space beside me, the ghost of him a cold spot on the sheets. The morning after had become the day after, and the silence was absolute. He was avoiding me. He had to be. Maybe he was even planning to move out. The thought was a fresh stab of pain. I had been a fool, a lonely, pathetic fool who had mistaken a moment of shared trauma for something more. He was the strong, silent type, the confident paramedic. He was straight. Yesterday had been an aberration, a statistical anomaly. And now things were back to normal. Except my normal was broken. My fortress was in ruins. He had shown me what it was like to have someone inside the walls, and now the emptiness was unbearable. The second day was even worse. The sliver of hope had curdled into a sour certainty of rejection. I felt raw, exposed. I didn't even try to work. I just sat in the armchair where he had kissed me, tracing the fabric with my fingers, my mind replaying every second, searching for the clue I had missed. The moment where I had misinterpreted everything. By evening, I had accepted it. It was over before it had even begun. I would have to learn to see him in the hallway again and pretend nothing had happened. I would have to rebuild my walls, stronger and higher this time. The thought was exhausting. It made my bones ache. I was making myself a sad, solitary dinner of toast and jam when I heard it. A knock on my door. Not a loud, confident knock. A soft, hesitant tapping. 3 quick raps, then a pause. My heart stopped. It couldn't be. I stood frozen in my kitchen, toast in hand. Maybe if I didn't move, if I didn't breathe, they would go away. Another knock, just as soft. My body moved without my permission. I put the toast down and walked to the door, my feet silent on the floorboards. I looked through the peephole. It was him, Marcus. He looked awful, worse than after the accident. His hair was a mess, like he'd been running his hands through it constantly. He was wearing a faded gray hoodie and jeans, not his uniform. There were dark circles under his eyes that hadn't been there before. He looked like he hadn't slept in 2 days. Just like me. He was holding a brown paper bag from a local bakery. It looked ridiculously out of place in his large, trembling hands. My own hand was shaking as I turned the deadbolt. I opened the door. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He was staring at the scuffed toes of his sneakers. "Hi," he said. His voice was a low rasp. "Hi." I managed to reply. My throat felt like it was full of sand. An awkward silence stretched between us in the doorway. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "I'm an idiot," he said finally, still looking at the floor. "I'm a complete, world-class idiot." He lifted his head then, and his eyes met mine. They were filled with a potent mixture of exhaustion and regret. And fear. He was afraid. The strong man, the hero, was terrified. "I shouldn't have just left," he said, the words coming out in a rush. "That was a coward's move. I woke up, and you were asleep, and you looked so peaceful. And I panicked. I didn't know what to do. So I ran. And I've spent the last 48 hours wanting to kick myself from here to next Tuesday." I just stared at him, my mind struggling to process his words. He wasn't disgusted. He wasn't ashamed. He was scared. "I brought you this," he said, holding out the paper bag. It was a clumsy, almost boyish gesture. "It's a croissant. A really good one. I don't know." I thought maybe it was an apology croissant. A small, hysterical laugh escaped my lips. An apology croissant? A hint of a smile touched his lips, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Yeah, it's a thing. Can I come in?" he asked, his voice soft again. Vulnerable. Or have I completely blown it? I stepped back and held the door open. "You haven't blown it." He walked inside, and the tension in my own body eased for the first time in 2 days. He hadn't run because of me. He'd run because of him, because of what he was feeling. He put the bag on the kitchen counter and turned to face me. He still looked nervous, out of his element. "Leo, he started, then stopped, running a hand over his hair. "Look, I'm not good at this. At talking about things. You did okay the other night," I offered gently. "That was different," he said. "That was work. This is new territory. And it scares the hell out of me." This was it. The clarifying conversation. The moment where we laid the cards on the table. "I've never felt that way," he said, his gaze fixed on a point over my shoulder. "About a guy. I don't even know what it means. All I know is that when I kissed you, it felt right. It felt more right than anything has in a very long time. And that scared me more than any 5-car pileup I've ever seen." He finally looked at me, his eyes pleading for understanding. "I spent my whole life being in control. I have to be. And with you, I'm not. I don't know the protocol. I don't know the procedure. I'm just lost." The honesty of his confession was a balm on the raw wound of the last 2 days. He wasn't rejecting me. He was grappling with a fundamental shift in his own identity. "I know the feeling," I said, and my voice was steady. "My whole life is a protocol, a routine. You're a disruption. A massive, terrifying, wonderful disruption." A real smile, small but genuine, finally touched his lips. "A disruption, huh? I've been called worse." He took a step closer. "So, what do we do?" "I don't know," I admitted. "This is new territory for me, too. I'm good with things that happened 300 years ago. Not this." "Okay," he said, nodding slowly. "Okay, how about we start with this?" He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He unlocked it and handed it to me. The new contact screen was open. "Put your number in," he said. "My actual number. Not the one you dial when your building is on fire." It was a simple gesture, but it felt monumental. It was an offering, a tangible act of commitment, a promise that he wouldn't just disappear again. I took the phone, my fingers brushing his. This time, the spark was familiar. "Welcome." I carefully typed in my name and number and handed it back. He looked at the screen, then back at me. "Leo," he said, testing my name on his tongue. He saved the contact. "Okay, step 1 complete. What's step 2? I asked, a sliver of hope, real and tenacious, blooming in my chest. "Step 2, he said, his voice gaining a little of its old confidence, "is I take you out for dinner. A proper date. No traumatic accidents. No shaking hands. No apology croissants. Just dinner. Would you like that?" "Yes," I said, the word coming out with more force than I intended. "Yes, Marcus. I would like that very much." He smiled, a full, genuine smile this time. It transformed his face, chasing away the exhaustion and the fear. In that moment, he wasn't the hero from apartment 4B or the broken man on my couch. He was just Marcus, and he was smiling at me. And for the first time in a very long time, my carefully ordered solitary world felt like it was expanding, not shrinking. It was a terrifying and exhilarating feeling, and I wouldn't have traded it for anything. The weeks that followed were a study in quiet revelation. Our first date was at a small, noisy Italian place he liked. It was awkward and stilted at first. We were two strangers who had shared a moment of profound intimacy, and now we had to learn how to make small talk. He asked about my work, and his eyes didn't glaze over as I talked about 17th century shipping manifests. I asked about his, and he told me stories, not of the horror, but of the small victories. The baby he delivered in the back of an ambulance. The elderly man whose life he saved, who now sent him a Christmas card every year. We were learning each other's language. He began to spend more nights at my apartment. At first, It was just after a bad shift when the ghosts were too close and his own apartment felt too empty. He would lie beside me in the dark, and we would just talk. He would tell me about his day, the raw, unfiltered version, and I would listen. I would tell him about my research, about the silent lives I was piecing together from letters and ledgers. He was the first person who had ever understood that the past wasn't dead. It was just quiet. Slowly, the foot of space between us and the bed disappeared. It was replaced by a brushed hand, a knee touching, and then, one night, he rolled over in his sleep and draped a heavy arm over my chest. I lay awake for an hour, not daring to move, just feeling the solid, comforting weight of him. I had never felt safer. My routine, my fortress, was gone. It had been replaced by a new one. Waking up to the sound of his breathing, the smell of his coffee brewing in my kitchen. He was an unholy coffee snob. The sight of his bulky uniform thrown over my reading chair. My quiet, monochrome world was now filled with his color, his noise, his life. One Saturday, he was at my place, sitting on my sofa, reading a novel, something he'd started doing, he said, to turn off his brain while I worked at my desk. The afternoon sun streamed through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. It was a scene of such profound, simple domesticity it made my heart ache with a feeling so new and overwhelming I couldn't name it. It was peace. He looked up, as if sensing my gaze, and gave me that small, easy smile that was now my favorite thing in the world. "What?" he asked. "Nothing," I said, smiling back. "Just, this is nice." "Yeah," he said, his eyes soft. It really is. He had become a part of my sanctuary, and I, in turn, had become a part of his. This morning, I woke to the gentle light of dawn filtering through the curtains. Marcus was still asleep beside me, his face relaxed, free from the lines of stress and exhaustion that so often shadowed it. One of his arms was thrown over my waist, holding me close. The frantic bird in my chest was long gone, replaced by a slow, steady, and contented beat. I slipped out of bed, careful not to wake him, and went into the kitchen. I put the kettle on, my Earl Grey, a ritual I still kept, and started the coffee maker for him. The two machines side by side on my counter, a perfect metaphor for our lives. Different, but coexisting in a warm and comfortable harmony. As I waited for the water to boil, I looked around my small apartment. It was still my space, still filled with my books and my history. But it was different now. It was a home. There was a pair of his scuffed boots by the door. His ridiculously oversized blue hoodie was slung over the back of a dining chair. There were two mugs by the sink instead of one. He was a disruption, a plot twist I never saw coming. I had built my life on the quiet certainty of solitude, believing it was a shield against the pain of the world. But it was just a cage. Marcus, with his own pain and his own chaos, hadn't just breached my walls. He had dismantled them brick by brick, and showed me that the world outside wasn't something to be feared. It was something to be lived. He taught me that true strength isn't about never shaking. It's about finding the person who will sit with you in the quiet dark until you stop. I heard a stirring from the bedroom, and a moment later, he appeared in the doorway, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. He gave me a lopsided, sleepy grin. "Morning," he mumbled, his voice thick with sleep. "Morning," I said, my heart swelling with that now familiar, peaceful warmth. "Coffee's almost ready." He shuffled over to me, wrapped his strong arms around me from behind, and rested his chin on my shoulder, his embrace warm and solid. We stood there for a moment, watching the morning light fill the room, the kettle beginning to whistle its cheerful song. And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that I was exactly where I was supposed to be,